if you see data points that are telling a pretty consistent story, great, no problem. If you're seeing a more muddled story and then 2020 shows up and all of a sudden things get pretty great, I think it raises the obvious question of which is the real performance that we should expect going forward.
Superclusters is where we demystify the secrets, stories, and tactics behind the money that moves the venture capital world. Today, you are in for a special treat, and we have Evan from Integra Global Advisors with us today. And I'm recording this little disclaimer at the beginning because if you're tuning in from the YouTube universe, it matters a little less if you're tuning in from Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any of these audio podcast platforms. But from YouTube, we hit a little video snafu, so to speak, where the video quality isn't nearly as good as some of these previous episodes we've had on. That said, the content will speak for itself, and I promise you'll learn something that you didn't know before, which is why I'm so excited for this conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to go straight into the introduction. You'll realize pretty quickly on why Evan is so damn amazing. So Evan Finkel is the Vice President of Private Equity and Venture Capital at Integra Global Advisors, an investment advisory firm serving ultra-high net worth families and charitable institutions where they invest in funds 1 through 3 across 4 distinct geographies: the US, Europe, Latin America, as well as Israel. You might recognize him as a selection committee member at both Slush in Helsinki, as well as Raise Global, 2 of the top communities for founders and early stage emerging managers, respectively. Evan comes from a machine learning background at Georgia Tech, as well as earned his stripes as an MBA at the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon. And I get a lot of folks on this pod from the Bay Area like myself, so it makes it extraordinarily exciting to welcome our second guest, hailing from the city of brotherly love. And if I were to lay out the mise en place for this episode, we cover things like the operational due diligence playbook, which Evan goes really deep into, as well as how Integra got their LPs comfortable with the fluidity of their investment model. And finally, and this is a hot take from Evan himself, but why IRR, internal rate of return, doesn't matter as much in VC. You'll got to tune into the entirety of the episode to actually hear why that's a hot take there and why he believes that. But as I mentioned at the beginning, something really, really fascinating about our conversation. And of course, without further ado, Evan, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me, David. Really excited to be doing this today.
I'm super excited. And if I might suggest a lead domino for this conversation, might I suggest we start with the topic of cold emails? And the reason I bring that up is because we started our friendship over a cold LinkedIn message. And I will say you are the first guest we've had on Superclusters where it's not by warm intro and not by, me reaching out or not by a pre-existing relationship. And I absolutely love that because I will say you've sent one of the best crafted cold messages I've ever received. And so I'm curious in your mind, what are the mechanics to a great cold email?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a challenging one. First, because in venture, just getting somebody's email or figuring out the best way to reach them is its own sort of exercise, right? You have to dig pretty deep sometimes, to actually figure out who you need to reach and what the best way to reach them is. To me, I think the biggest thing is, given that venture is such a people business and such a people game, even if you don't have a warm intro, you could sort of like hack together a backdoor warm intro. And so I think when I emailed you, one of the things I mentioned is, hey, we have these 3, 4, 5 mutual connections at these, firms. If you need to, look into me before you decide whether this is worth responding to, why don't you go back to them and see, if they have good things or bad things to say about me. And I guess I got enough thumbs up, or the bluff worked well enough, right? That you maybe didn't look and you just decided, hey, it's worth responding to this guy. But I think that's really the key, right? Is short, sweet, to the point. And people are getting tons of cold emails. I get them all the time. You have to make a decision about whether to respond or not, right? And I really think if you can hack together, a lukewarm intro through your cold email or figure out a path to making it warmer, I think that's super helpful. And then the other thing is just try to add value, right? If you have an ask or you have something you can do to add value, or you have something you're willing to give of yourself, I think that tends to lead to a higher response rate, right? So, to me, the biggest challenge is figuring out who at a firm to email and what their email address is. And then the rest you just sort of slot into place.
And I will say, so at least when you messaged me, I was like, oh, you know what? Like, it's not often, and in fact, this is probably the first time when I've received a cold message or cold email where someone's like, hey, you can fact check me. You can talk to these like 4 or 5 individuals, and I'm sure they'll give you kind of like their testimonial on me. So I actually did. I actually went to those. Like, I went to
Cool.
3 of them, which was like I have on a texting basis. And I was like, just out of curiosity, have you ever heard of this guy called Evan Finkel? And every single like of those 3 people, all of them were like gave you glowing remarks of the kind of individual in which you are. And I'm like, okay, you know what? That's great. And what I love about that is you didn't even have to ask these 5 people for an introduction, but it goes great lengths to be able to say, hey, you can fact check me here, and they've given you external validation. And I think it's a cold email in its like strictest, most technical definition, but at the same time, there is some social rapport that goes with it that replicates what a warm intro is meant to do. So anyways, I wanted to start there just because I
Sure.
enjoyed it so much, and I wanted you to talk about it, at least the thought process behind it, and at least for our listeners, whether they're LPs or GPs, they can probably do something similar, which is actually really funny because the first guest that we've had from the city of brotherly love happened to be someone who'd also done a bunch of cold emailing, and someone you also know well, Jamie Rode, at the
Oh,
time
yeah.
at Veritas and now at Screen Door. So
Yeah, she's
anyways,
great. Yeah, I think that's the key, right? I mean, I think whether you're a GP reaching out to a founder, right? Whether you're an LP reaching out to a GP or just reaching out to somebody in the ecosystem, make yourself valuable from the get go and figure out a way to give that person warm and fuzzy feelings about you, right? Even if it's not like a formal warm intro from somebody you both know. And, it's not 100% response rate, but it certainly helps.
it worked on me, and I imagine
And
there's
here we
some
are.
magic
So,
there. And here we are, and so speaking of messaging, and this is going off kind of like script a little bit. um One of my favorite Evan fun facts, which is the first time when we chatted, you told me something that I was just like, holy cow, this is very interesting, which is you have a past where you had, like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but a $1 billion marketing budget for sports stadiums, and you did all the data science and marketing that was associated with it. And so it sounds like you've been like in the boxing ring for messaging for a very long time, and I'm curious how that experience, having maybe collectively together $1 billion budget for sports stadiums, which demand some of the most attention, at least in American society. How does that shape the way you think about messaging, cold emails, marketing today?
yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, I think to sort of pull back here, right? And when I was at Anheuser-Busch, they're one of the largest marketers in the U.S. They spend, at least when I was there, upwards of $1 billion, I think, on marketing the U.S. sports stadiums and otherwise. They're hard to escape. For me, I think the biggest things to sort of keep in mind, right, around messaging and frankly how we and we'll get into this later, but we at Integra think about venture is you can't measure everything precisely, but you can be data informed. And so I think that's the biggest piece here is you always should try to improve your ability to measure things, whether it's, a $500,000 investment check or whether it's $1 billion marketing budget or more. But you should really be thinking about, how can we constantly improve what we're doing here. And so sometimes that's collecting more data. Sometimes it's figuring out what to do with the data points that you have. Sometimes it's figuring out what the problems are that you're not even thinking about solving that could be solved with the data that you have. But to me, the way that I think about whether it's cold emails, right, or whether it's about how we actually invest, it's what can we do here that's data informed, even if it's not data driven or sort of data is being used to make the decision without any other input. And so, I've definitely like A/B tested informally like different cold email styles just to figure out what's going to work the best and how does this work. And, your sample sizes are what they are, right? But ultimately, I found that there are certain things that work, and that goes for cold emails. It goes for how we think about venture. It goes for how I sort of think about my life broadly. Sometimes you make a purely data-based decision. Other times you're data informed. But I do think that, if you have the right data points or the ability to collect them, using that is really valuable as an input. And it's helpful as a check for yourself, right? Because your instinct, your emotion might not match the data. And sometimes you go with what you think instinctually, or sometimes you go with what your emotion says or what your gut says. But at least having that point where you take a step back and say, okay, here's what the data says. Maybe I'm not going to go with the data-driven, decision right now, or the data dictated decision, but I at least have to justify to myself why, right? If I'm going to ignore the data, what's the reason? Not that I'm ignoring the data, but why I don't think the data is actually applicable in this particular situation. And then I could go forward with that other decision. But I think having that data gives you a point to sort of stop and look back before you make any decision and say, how should I be thinking about this? Are there angles that I'm missing? How can I increase the probability that I get the outcome that I'm looking for?
And if we could put that under a microscope for a second, and I know it's been a couple of years since you've been there, but I'm curious, what are examples of potentially data in which you would choose to ignore, and what are reasons that you might choose to ignore such sets of data, at least in the context of marketing and in sports stadiums?
Yeah, so I think, at Anheuser-Busch, we had a lot of really good data about sales and where we were marketing and exactly how that marketing was being viewed by people in different contexts, or, what their perspective on the effectiveness of that marketing was. You don't always have that, though, right? Sometimes you have much wider error bars. So you look at venture capital, for instance, and you're looking at a first-time venture manager, and, you look at their angel track record. They have a couple of angel investments. There's some markups. They tell you, I've done 12x and I've invested in 3 unicorns. And you look at their track record and you say, okay, yes, they have done 12x. Yes, they've invested in 3 unicorns. But as it turns out, they invested in those companies in 2020, 2021. And so that track record still stands, but we need to contextualize it a little bit more. And we need to figure out, is there something here, or was their performance the result of, just being in the right place at the right time and having to put a couple of angel checks to work, in a particularly frothy market environment. And so you may say, you know what, the track record is really amazing in a vacuum, right? But once we contextualize it, we say, you know what, we need to get some more data points here. We're not going to be able to do this one-one. It's just not going to be for us. And so I think really understanding the context there, and that has happened. There have been a lot of cases where we've seen funds where, the manager did a couple of investments, in the frothy, heady times the last couple of years, and then they go and they launch their own fund. And we just feel like, yes, even though there are some data points that indicate some success, it's not a robust enough data set, let's say. And so we'll go ahead and we'll say, we like this, we'll keep an eye on it, we'll keep tracking it, but we're not going to be able to make it an affirmative decision to move forward with the fund based on, 2 or 3 data points, no matter how good those data points might be, right? We just are not going to be able to get there necessarily.
I'm curious, statistically speaking, what defines a robust enough data set? Obviously, 2 to 3 investments are not nearly enough to show what a track record looks like, but is there a number that indicates critical mass of investments for a track record?
I guess the real answer is kind of squishy, unfortunately.
Evan, why are you doing this to me?
Yeah. I think the challenge is it's not only about the number of data points necessarily, right? It's the number of data points, it's the time over which they've had to mature, it's the sectors, it's the stages, it's how those deals were sourced, it's where they were sourced, right? It's the role that the person who made the investment actually played. Was it my buddy starting a startup, I wrote a $5,000 check? Is it, I was the lead at a previous firm and, I pounded the table for this deal against, the 2 more senior partners and it got over the line. And, now I'm the most trusted advisor to the CEO. And so I think all that context really matters. I think the other point here, right, in VC is just that we don't really know if you're a good investor probably ever, right? Like even after a 10 or 12-year fund, given just the mathematics and the statistics right behind like sampling from power law distributions, and given the number of data points in a fund, and just thinking about how long it takes and the amount of randomness or like pseudo randomness that's involved in like a startup, I actually don't know that you ever know, even when you retire after 40 years, if you're actually a good investor, or if you just got lucky enough times that, your funds turned out to like return what your investors wanted. And so I think what we are trying to do is basically play like a probabilistic game, right? And say, there are a bunch of data points. They were over a long enough time period. We feel like there's, substantial reason to believe that this person can replicate this going forward. And I think as you start to look at those pieces, you get a directional view on a manager. And that's why I say that we're data informed and not like data driven, because there are, I think, VCs that deploy on a purely like data driven approach, right? Or if you think about the hedge fund world, right, there are quant shops where humans are basically not involved in the investment decisions. I don't really think that that works in VC because you don't have enough data points. You don't have enough data points over a long enough period of time. There's a lot of randomness that's very difficult to measure, right? There's no variable for, VC invested in a great company and then the founder got in a fight with his girlfriend and was being rude to his co-founder and the company broke up, right? So I think you have to look at a lot of different pieces from a lot of different angles and then figure out whether directionally they seem to be telling a similar and compelling story and a differentiated story. And if that's the case, then, we can move forward with our due diligence and with figuring out whether this is something we want to invest in. But I don't know that we will ever reach a point where we say we have these 7 data points, binary go, no go decision without any further due diligence, because I just don't know that that's responsible, right, on behalf of our clients or our limited partners.
I'm curious. I want to like double click on a word that you mentioned just now, which is the word replicate. What are telltale signs in your mind or in your team's mind where a fund manager is capable of replicating previous results?
So I'd say things that we believe increase the probability that it's going to happen, because again, I think that's really important here, is that this is all sort of probabilistic, right? To me, what we are looking for, whether it's a fund one and we're saying, can you replicate your angel track record or your track record at a previous firm, or it's a fund two or a fund three or fund four, and we're saying, can you replicate what you did in earlier funds? It's how close is the strategy, in this fund to previous funds or to what you executed on previously. How similar is the fund size, check size, stage, sector, geography? And so I think what we're looking for is, if you figured out what made you successful, like be the best $30 million like pre-seed fintech manager you can be. Don't try to be like $150 million multi-stage fintech plus health tech manager across 3 geographies. So for us, it's, have you as the manager figured out what you're the best in the world at, like what your superpower is? And are you comfortable and confident enough in what you're doing to stick with just that superpower? And I think what we tend to find is, particularly as firms grow, unfortunately, the answer is no, or the temptation to raise more money or to change the strategy or to expand the geographic sector or stage focus sometimes overwhelms managers. And that is a challenge. It's unfortunate because it means that sometimes managers are just no longer relevant for our venture program. But I also think it's unfortunate for those managers because they really can be the best in the world at something. And if they focused on that thing, I actually think long term that would be much more successful for many of them. I think the challenge is that raising a lot of money is tempting, obviously, and doing more is always tempting, right? We made a lot of fund managers where they say, well, we're just going to do the same thing, but more. And the challenge there is that doesn't always work out, right? So if you previously wrote $250,000 checks and now you say we want to write $1 million checks, that sounds great on paper. But if I call a founder who you previously invested in and I say, hey, would you have taken $1 million from these guys? And like, no, we never could have because somebody else was leading the round and we never would have given up, that fund. Well, your model kind of breaks a little bit, right? Or when you look at the data that's available around fund size versus performance, it's fine to say we're going to do the same thing but more, except that we know that at some point that breaks, right? And you can't just keep doing the same thing but more indefinitely or at any fund size. And so I think for us, it's, have you identified what you're the best in the world at? Are you going to keep doing that? Are you going to stick with it? And do we think that the things you've done in the past translate really nicely to the strategy you're executing on here? And so that's really how we try to think about it.
What I'm hearing you say, and feel free to correct me here, is that in the world of the thesis, let's say pre-seed fund writing 250K checks into fintech, at least in that statement, there's like 3 variables that are out there. There's stage, there's industry, and then there's check size, right? Of that strategy, let's say that strategy has been very successful for a manager in fund one or in their angel track record. How much of that thesis can be up to variable. So how much can they change? Can they go from pre-seed to like pre-seed and seed, but still fintech fund, still 250K? Does that sit in a warm spot for you? Or like, what are the number of variables? Sorry, this is a messy question, but like, what are the
Sure.
number of variables that a fund manager can abstract for an LP like yourself to still have comfort around their deployment strategy?
Right. So the way that I think about this is like, if you think about each variable, if you're sort of going to an adjacent sandbox or an adjacent square on some of these variables, I think we're still reasonably comfortable. So for instance, if you are doing pre-seed and you think, we're also going to do seed, that feels reasonably comfortable. I'm not that concerned about that. If you say, we love doing fintech, but we also think there's a massive opportunity in health tech, that to me, I'm much less comfortable in. If you say maybe we like fintech and there's some areas of the prop tech market that we think are interesting, right? Or we think that we used to be doing embedded fintech, and now we think there's an area in another subsector of fintech that could be really compelling. So I think those are areas where we would feel comfortable. I think the further away you get from the original thesis, the more we have to look at it and say, do you really have a differentiated advantage here? And I think the other place we see this, honestly, is not only with solo GPs, but when we look at like VC firms with multiple partners, one of the things that we do, and I don't think that many firms do this, is that we will take every deal that a firm has done. So angel track record, previous previous work that the partners have done, all the deals that they've done at the current firm, and we will pop them into like an Excel template, basically. And we will just start cutting and slicing the data by stage, by sector, by partner, by year, by geography. And what you tend to find is really, really interesting is that there is meaningfully bifurcated performance in some of these areas. And so you might have one partner, maybe it's a two-person firm, they're doing health tech and fintech. One partner is doing focused on fintech, one's focused on health tech. And what you start to see is actually like one partner is really carrying the firm, right? All the health tech deals are doing well, fintech deals are not doing well. Or, the partnership is working on three sectors, and you start to cut and slice and you realize, hey, that third that you're doing in, B2B SaaS is going really, really well. The 2/3 that you're doing in those other two sectors, not really going well at all, to put it kindly. And so you start to ask questions about whether it really makes sense to invest in a fund in which you think 2/3 of the money is basically going in the garbage. And for us, the answer is no. But I do think that what we tend to see, or what I tend to see when I speak to other LPs, is that a lot of LPs look very high level. And so if things look great at a high level, they assume, well, this fund is great at doing, fintech and health tech. But what they maybe don't dive into quite as deeply, and maybe what they should, is, are all the returns really coming from fintech and health tech? Or is this the case where, one of those sectors is driving all those returns and one is not? In which case, we should have a conversation about why this firm is spending half their time focused on that sector, and whether it makes sense for us as an LP to be in a fund where, half the money is going into a sector where there's no particular expertise.
I want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, which is one of the kind of examples in which you use where there's one fund manager, let's say doing health tech, phenomenal
Sure.
track record. There's another partner in the same fund doing fintech, but slightly not really driving the returns of the fund or in terms of previous track record. What is your reaction when you see a partnership like that? Because if I were perfectly rational, what it sounds like is you two should, like, with a partner that is like let's say driving 90% of the returns on health tech, should just be doing their own thing and not really
Sure.
inviting like a fintech strategy. But like, I guess like my question is like, how do you react to that?
I would say, without getting into specific names, there are definitely cases where I've had conversations with people and sort of said, why do you think that this is a good partnership, right? Or why do you think that it makes sense for you guys as a firm going forward? And for us, we just don't invest in those funds, candidly. There are some really, by reputation, I'd say top tier firms globally that we've had the opportunity to diligence, and we start diving in and we see something we don't really like. Whether it could be about a partner split in terms of performance, it could be that, a firm decides they want to add another geography and they start, devoting a quarter, a third, or more of their capital to a new geography where they just don't have that expertise. And we just don't really invest in those funds. That to us, it is sort of a deal breaker, mostly because we are looking at things from a portfolio perspective, right? And so I don't need to have a certain number of managers that fit like a certain sector thesis or a certain a certain like box that needs to be checked. For us, it's really about finding the best performing managers. And I think something that goes into being one of the best performing managers is understanding what you're good at and doing that over and over and over and over again. And so funds that have not been able to identify sort of where they're best and allocate their capital are not necessarily funds that we feel comfortable allocating our capital to. And so to me, when I speak to GPs, one of the things that we ask about, we don't always get satisfactory answers, but one of the things we at least try to ask about for funds that are on like a fund two or a fund three is, what's your process for determining whether, everybody is pulling their weight around the table? And if people are not, what do you do about that? And I tend to find that partnerships don't spend a lot of time thinking about that. I think part of it is because when you start a partnership with somebody, whether it's a VC fund, whether it's a startup, whether it's something else, you have to sort of implicitly believe that they're pulling their own weight and that you're pulling your weight, right? I mean, that's the bet that you're making, is that everybody's going to be pulling their weight.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that people aren't trying their best. I'm just saying that there is not always a line from trying their best to the performance that we need. And so ultimately for us, that's a deal breaker. We really need to be involved in funds where we feel like everybody is not only pulling their weight, but where there's a pretty clear line between effort and results, or, the things that people are focusing on and, bearing fruits in those particular areas. And so for us, that's something that would be a deal breaker, which is not to say, and this is maybe not really what you asked about, but I'll sort of add it anyway, because I think it's instructive. That's not to say that we wouldn't invest in a fund, let's say, where there's a partner who just got promoted and maybe they just don't have as long of a track record. We're open to that, obviously. But I think if we see that there's a partnership that's been pretty stable and static for, a couple of fund cycles or for a long period of time, and we just feel like the data is heavily weighted toward, a particular sector, a particular stage, particular geo partner, whatever the case may be, that's just not the type of fund that we tend to feel is a good and responsible place to invest our capital.
I think I know the answer to it, but I want to ask just to make sure I'm not
Sure.
assuming anything, which is, let's say, and in the case of hypothetical, is just like an example where there's like two, three partners, but one of the partners happens to be like, quote unquote, an operating partner. So technically they're a
Sure.
partner in name, but they don't really have any track record, nor do they think about relying on a track record in terms of how they help. And one of them could just like be like the portfolio support partner, like extraordinarily helpful for founders, and the other two partners are just like the investing partners. Does that, in that, let's say, partnership of three, do you just evaluate track record based on the first two partners, and you kind of, I don't want to say ignore the third partner, but because it's not like an investing partner, you don't care as much when it comes to underwriting the investments of a portfolio?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I think we try to weigh it based on how much capital we think they're going to deploy, right? I mean, I think you could even give an example where there are three investing partners. One of them is maybe on his way out, but he's still kind of partial, or she is partially involved, right? Maybe they're doing, one or two deals over the life cycle of the fund. I will generally be less concerned about their performance than I will about the partners who are deploying 80 or 90% of the capital, right? I mean, I think the level of concern is, or the level of focus is going to be sort of proportional to the amount of capital, right, that we expect somebody to be deploying.
Evan, we've gone on this windy path, and we've like, from question number one, we've already gone off script, which I actually absolutely love because I think there's so much meat and potatoes there as well. But one of the things that I find fascinating that I think will set a large part of the conversation, give context on, is, Evan, you've come from a machine learning background, and that is not typical of a background that most LPs have. And one thing I'm really curious about, just to like, get the 10,000 foot tall view effectively, is, you know, between 2000 and 2019, one of the things I find to be very interesting is that you received two bachelor degrees from two different universities. I'm curious, one from a more business perspective and one from a more like technical perspective, computer
Yeah.
science and machine learning. What was the self-talk that was going through your mind when you felt that a degree in business administration and leading one of like your campuses at the time, like University of Miami, one of the first student investment groups in the home of Sebastian the Ibis, was not enough?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So basically, I after graduation, I worked at a consulting firm. I worked for Anheuser-Busch. Both were in relatively quantitative roles. A lot of statistical econometric modeling, a lot of data, a lot of math. And around, I guess it was like 2016, I sort of took a big picture look at like where my career was at that point and sort of where the world was going. And to me, I felt like I had an aptitude for the type of math or the type of physics or the type of like computer science work that goes into AI. And clearly, I saw where the world was moving towards, and I felt like if I looked back 40 years, if I looked back in 40 years and sort of said, the world is moving toward AI, toward data, toward machine learning, and I could have been involved in that in some capacity, or I could have sharpened those skills and I passed on it, would I be happy or not happy? And I think I was pretty clear that I would not be happy with that decision. And so actually the original plan when I left Anheuser-Busch was to go back to school to do a PhD in either applied math or quantum mechanics. And then I thought I would do like a startup after that. And so I spent a lot of time talking to my wife about this, and she was totally on board, much to her credit, because I think it's fair to say that both my parents and my mother-in-law thought that I and we were insane when I left a good corporate job to go back to school. And so my wife, much to her credit, fully supported me, was right by my side, and really thought the same thing, that if I had the aptitude for these areas and that's really where I thought the world was going, then it made sense to do what I could to put myself in a position for success, right? And so I left a good corporate job at Anheuser-Busch to do a second bachelor's degree basically. And so the idea behind the second bachelor's degree was I was going to do this PhD in applied math or quantum mechanics. I had an aptitude for math. I had done a lot of stuff professionally related to math and data, but I actually didn't have like just the right courses on a piece of paper that would say like, you could check enough boxes to be able to get into one of these top tier PhD programs. And so CUNY had this actually quite clever program where you could transfer in 90 of your existing undergrad credits and basically do like a second bachelor's degree. It's like 30 credits, 10 courses of customized coursework and a customized degree. And so it was really an accident that I got this second bachelor's degree. The real purpose was just to go back and check off like the advanced math and the advanced physics courses and computer science that I would need to get into one of these, top tier PhD programs. And along the way, they gave me a second piece of paper. And so that's really, really how that worked out. That was never really part of the plan necessarily. It was really just
Yeah.
about taking the coursework. And then ultimately, I wound up doing a master's degree in machine learning through Georgia Tech instead of a PhD, in part related to just the need and the desire to support my wife's career, and for us, to logistically to commit to a PhD in one place while waiting for residency and fellowship to shake out was just too challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wound up doing this master's degree in machine learning. And the truth is, it actually worked out pretty nicely because when COVID hit in 2020, we were not really disrupted at all. We were online. The program continued. And so had I been in a PhD program, I think it would have been quite a bit more challenging. It certainly would have been challenging as we moved around, for fellowship. And so ultimately, I think things worked out pretty nicely, but it was not obvious at the time, I think, to anybody, maybe other than my wife and myself. And yeah, much to her credit, she supported me when my parents and my mother-in-law for sure thought we were clinically insane. Yeah, but it's worked out quite nicely at this point.
I mean, there's something to be said like, hey, you know what? You might think I'm clinically insane, but I married someone who's a doctor. So if anything, she would
Sure.
be the sane person, to tell me that if I should do something or not. That's hilarious. One of the threads that I wanted to touch on, because I don't really see, if I put it this way, track record, or at least on your resume, it doesn't look like there's like enough kind of public evidence on this, which is
Sure.
the world of quantum mechanics. And I know you're not in the world of quantum mechanics right now, but what was the motivating reason as you were thinking about doing quantum mechanics for school? And what drew you towards that, and how did you go from quantum mechanics and math to AI and machine learning?
I think for me, the impetus was doing something that was heavily mathematically and statistically driven, and much of quantum mechanics, right, is math and statistics and probability, and so for me, it was a lot of personal interest. It happened to be the case that I felt like my personal interest and the skills that I would pick up along the way would be transferable, right? So I think if you do a PhD in quantum mechanics or applied math, you can certainly pick up a job in AI or machine learning, right? Just given the math that you've done and the programming that you sort of learn along the way. And so I felt like the personal interest plus the fact that those skills would map quite nicely right to AI or to machine learning, I thought would be sort of a nice combination. To me, it was really about doing something where I could really challenge myself, and I could spend a couple of years like thinking really deeply about not only like first order effects of things, but also like secondary and tertiary effects of various things in probabilistic ways. It just sort of lined up with how I think my mind tends to work. And so I thought it would be just interesting and edifying, and I would enjoy it from a personal perspective. But it certainly didn't hurt that it would then sort of provide a clear path into the AI or machine learning world. To me, approaching things from like a computer science angle was just less interesting. It was just less of a path that I thought was going to be quite as compelling for me. I thought the math-driven angle would be much more interesting and line up much more with sort of what I wanted to do personally. Knowing, though, that when you learn the math in an applied math PhD program, or you go through the work in those courses, you could then slot into a job nicely in AI or machine learning. So I just felt like it would be sort of the most interesting path for me, combined with one that would lead me to the desired outcome at the end professionally.
That makes an immense amount of sense, and I love how intentional.
It didn't at the time, by the way. I mean, the story is nice now, but it was
Hindsight
all
bias, right?
I mean, it was all a little bit crazy at the time, certainly, right? I mean, I think things worked out nicely with Integra, which was not obvious at the time when I had planned on leaving Anheuser-Busch. They worked out well academically, and so there was a plan certainly in the beginning, but it was not obvious that plan was necessarily going to work out. And ultimately, things worked out, but they didn't work out exactly according to plan.
Right.
And so I think you have to have some degree of flexibility there. But yeah, overall, at least in hindsight, the story fits quite nicely together.
It does. I'm already imagining like what your memoir would look like, and chapters in that memoir that you'll write 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now.
Well, we'll see if I accomplish anything memoir worthy before we start drafting chapters.
You are an incredible storyteller, and I imagine it's only a matter of time. Either you put it on paper or you, I don't know, record maybe the future memoir is recording an audiobook before you actually write the book itself, right? There might be a version of that. To bring us back from quote unquote this commercial break that we took away from the world of the LP stuff,
Sure.
I would be remiss not to ask you about Integra, because that name has come up quite a few times, and obviously that's where you are at right now. And so I'm curious, there's a lot of lore surrounding the mystical world of limited partners, and I want to inch our way into the world of Integra at this point. But where were you in life when the opportunity presented itself to you?
Yeah, so this was part of like the happy accident. So I had been planning to leave Anheuser-Busch, in late 2016, and I had met one of the founding partners of Integra, Gil Orbeck, somewhat randomly several months before. Actually, we had met randomly, and then his family had invited my family over for a Sabbath meal, actually. And as my wife likes to tell it, she's never quite seen two people mind meld in real time, like in the same way. And so, yeah, we really just clicked. And then when I was leaving Anheuser-Busch and Integra was starting, the opportunity sort of popped up, and I was at that point, I would say, indexing toward working with people that I enjoyed working with, which is not necessarily a commentary on my previous employers, but it's also not a commentary on them. And so, I felt like the opportunity to work with Gil, who's somebody I really enjoyed being around and speaking with and sort of riffing on ideas with, would be an interesting opportunity. The plan at that point was not for it to be my forever job. It was really just an interesting opportunity to work on some interesting stuff with some people I liked working with, while also completing the second bachelor's degree and then what I thought was going to be the PhD. And so that's really how it started. I mean, it was really serendipitous. And we just took it from there, and the role has evolved. The firm has continued to grow, and I've continued to, change sort of my area of focus within Integra over time. And obviously now it's VC oriented, but in the beginning that was not obvious. And that was not necessarily the original impetus of taking the role. But certainly over time, I would say, my role within Integra has continued to evolve as the firm has continued to grow and evolve. But that's sort of how we wound up here. Happy accident, I would say.
I'm so curious. What was the original impetus? What was his pitch to you? Did he just clearly you and Gil mind melded like in no other in the words of your wife. But what was that call to you? What did he call you saying, "Hey, Evan, I'm starting Integra. Would love to work together to do X." What was X?
Some of it was like, I guess, nominally more client oriented, but a lot of it was sort of what I'll call like a little bit of everything. Only because when you're starting a firm like that, right, there are just things that crop up that, you don't necessarily have a person whose title is like deal with X, right? And so, I think it was more, we built a high degree of trust very quickly. And so it was, hey, could you take a look at this? Or, hey, I value the way that you think about something. Can you maybe look into this, do a research project, and I think over time it evolved from these like ad hoc sort of things, which I think I would argue were value add, but were not necessarily like easily definable in terms of a job description. But it evolved over time into a more venture focused role, obviously, and that's become a much bigger part of Integra. But in the beginning, just like any other startup, there's a lot to be done. There's not necessarily a person whose job title or job description exactly maps to anything that needs to be done. And so I think it was more, hey, we had, we had good conversations. We, clearly enjoy like riffing on things with each other, right? Or I appreciate the way that you think and you appreciate the way that I think. And so, would you want to join the firm, right? Do you think that, this would be interesting to you, that there would be opportunities there that would make sense? Again, it was not meant to be a forever job. I don't even know if it was meant to be a 7-year job where we are now, right? But I think in the beginning, it was just, I want to work with people that I like and trust. From Gil's, that was Gil's perspective, I think, and people that will help me build this firm and will be part of the story that we're writing here. And to me, having, leaving Anheuser-Busch, I felt like, I want to work with people that I like. I would like to do something candidly, right, that keeps a little bit of income flowing in while I'm in school, because I thought, okay, I'm about to do a second degree and then a PhD. And so, I like rice and pasta, but I don't want to be eating rice and pasta for another 6 years. And so it kind of just worked, I think, for both parties. But I think the foundation was trust and respect and, valuing the way that we each think. And certainly, I was extremely junior to Gil, right? We were not equals, right? I mean, it was Gil's firm and I was an employee amongst other employees. But I think that right off the bat, we just had a very high level of trust and respect, and we valued the way that we each apply our minds to different types of problems. And so I think that was really the foundation. I think that's still very much the foundation. And I consider Gil a good friend now, and somebody, whose advice I value a lot on personal and professional matters. And I think he would say that, I'm a good friend as well, and somebody whose opinions carry a lot of weight with him. But I think it's really built on that foundation of, trust and respect and, being intrigued by or valuing the way that the other person thinks about problems.
And you might be guessing where I'm going here, more for a narrative or story kind of thing, where
Sure.
you had a conversation with Gil and you were just deeply impressed by the way he approached a problem. That you're like, holy cow, the way Gil's mind works is just second to none.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, like the way that we built Integra, or the way that we are building Integra, and certainly based a lot on obviously Gil's vision for the firm, but um, if you think about the way like a physicist thinks about a problem like from first principles. I think broadly, like in financial services, it happens in venture too, but financial services broadly, there's a lot of inertia, right? People sort of say like, this is how other people do it. This is how I'm going to do it, or this is how we always did it. And so we'll just continue doing it this way. One of the things I really admired about the way that Gil is building Integra and the way that he thinks about things is, he breaks things down into first principles and says, what should we be doing, and what, because it's really the best way to do this and that's why other people do it, and what should we be changing because other people maybe do this, or a lot of people do this, but it's actually not the most efficient way to do this. And so as an example, one of the things that we've thought about at Integra is, what should we buy versus what should we build, right? Which I think sounds really obvious, but if you really think about a firm like ours that's managing wealth for ultra high net worth families, foundations, endowments, pensions, they all have a variety of needs, but there are also certain things either for regulatory or compliance reasons that we need to have, or that just to be a functional firm you need to have, some of which add value, others of which you have to be right 100% of the time, but they don't actually necessarily add incremental value. And so if you think about like the mid and back office functions, they're extraordinarily important, right? And you could lose a client if you mess things up in mid and back office, but you're never going to win a new client because you have the most impressive mid and back office in the world, right? And so figuring out, okay, what should we actually be doing internally in terms of, let's say, mid and back office or client support, and where should we try to find a vendor that's actually going to provide specialized expertise where we know, they're going to get this right 100% of the time, and how should we be thinking about that? To me, even a trivial example like that is very different than how a lot of firms think about this, right? I think a lot of firms say we need to staff up, we need a big impressive mid office and a big impressive back office and a big impressive front office, and you do need an impressive mid and back office, but they don't necessarily have to be big, and you don't necessarily have to have all those people, as sort of first party employees. You can figure out who's the best in the world at doing mid and back office. And if we don't believe that it's going to be us, like if we don't believe we have any specialized expertise in putting together a mid or back office, let's not put together like a massive mid and back office internally. Let's figure out who are the people who can actually execute on what we need in the most efficient way. And let's sign those vendors. And so even something trivial like that, I think, is very different than how a lot of people tend to think about these problems, where they say, well, everybody else has a big mid and back office, so I need a big mid and back office too.
How did you go around picking the right vendor to work with? Were there questions that you, Gil, the team were asking to ask yourselves and or the vendors to better help you appreciate what a great vendor for mid and back office looks like?
Yeah, so I guess at a very high level, because honestly, some of my colleagues were much more involved in this than I was. But I think high level, right? It's sort of the same questions that we ask of anyone, right? Like, why do we believe that you have the right expertise here, right? Why do we believe that you're the best in the world at doing this? Why do we believe you're the most efficient in the world at doing this, right? What are the processes that you have in place, whether it's an investment process or whether it's, a statement generation and quality control process, to ensure that, people are looking at this from as many angles as possible to make sure that, we increase the probability of getting things right and decrease the probability of getting things wrong, right? And we're trying to optimize, right?
I love that the machine learning mind is coming out throughout this conversation.
I think that's always, I just think it's frameworks, right? It's not necessarily prescriptive, but I think it's like a helpful framework.
Yeah.
Obviously, you have to be sort of like, you have to be flexible on that framework, right? And that framework has to be a little bit malleable. But I think in general, right, thinking about things from first principles and breaking them down, or thinking about things in terms of frameworks, I think is helpful. And so I think it's the same way we think about vendors, right? Is, why are you the best in the world at doing this, right? What's the differentiated expertise that you're bringing to the table? Are you good at all parts of the business here, right? Or should we further split this up and say, you're going to handle X, but you're not going to handle Y. We're going to have somebody else who's the best in the world at Y. right? Does the pricing make sense, right? Like, how do we think about all that? And so I think it's all wrapped up in that. I would add that for us, it's a little bit more complicated, maybe, or we have to be extra thoughtful because we're SEC regulated, right? And so ensuring that on the compliance side and on the legal side, that we're doing things in a way that is compliant, and we always want to make sure that we are acting in a way that is putting the best interest of our clients first, right? I mean, I think that's a guiding principle, both from a formal fiduciary perspective, but even informally, I think we've tried to build a firm in a way that emphasizes that. And I would say, we'll get into this later with venture, but I don't know that every venture firm necessarily puts the interests of its investors first. And so I think the way that we try to build Integra and the way that we try to think about managing client money broadly and how we make decisions is, what are our guiding principles, and how can we execute on them best using frameworks or breaking down problems into individual components in a way that allows us to maximize the value that we're deriving and passing through to our clients.
Thank you for the great segue, because I
I
would
know it's
love
a
to.
long answer to a short question, but
No, it's a great answer to a short question. And my purpose here is to give myself less time on air and more time for you to be on air, because you're the wizard here. Um, but speaking of venture and the world of mid and back office, and this kind of bleeds into a topic that we both love to talk about, which is the world of diligence. How do you like in the world of kind of operational diligence, less of the business diligence? We can talk about that as well, but I'm curious. The operational diligence part of things is the quote unquote not so sexy part of kind of evaluating a venture fund, and
sure.
emerging managers are more likely to not have a like superfluous kind of mid and back office. And before this sounds like Klingon and Elvish to our listeners, do you mind giving us the lay of the land of how do you think about operational due diligence, and what are the things you actually look at? What are the variables, levers you look at when you do that diligence?
First, shameless plug, if I'm allowed to do this.
Yes,
I am happy
always.
to share my operational due diligence request list with anybody who wants it. Because I don't think it's secret or proprietary, and because I think it will make the ecosystem better as a whole, right? For people to share these things, and so anybody who wants it, free option basically.
Where do they go? Do they go on LinkedIn? Do they go on your email? Like, where do they go find you?
Yeah, I guess they could email me. Would probably be best.
Okay.
Should I drop my email
You should
here?
drop it. Like, come on,
Is that
Evan.
right?
If you're going to do a shameless plug, you need to
Okay.
see it through.
All right. So it's Evan Evan dot Finkel Finkel at Integra GAINTEGRAGA.com. And yeah, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share it because again, I think these types of things are not really secret or proprietary. And I think it makes the whole ecosystem better when LPs as a whole are more informed about these things. And frankly, if I send it to somebody and they're like, hey, you're actually not asking about this and maybe you should be, awesome. Like I would like to improve my processes as well, right? So to me, it's actually mutually beneficial because I know there are people who do this in a different way than we do, and I'm more than happy to learn from those people as well. So yeah, shameless plug. But in terms of what we ask for, right? I mean, I think there are a few things that we really key in on high level. So I think one is valuation policy, right? I think it's super important. To figure out whether you feel confident that the firms are even making a bare minimum attempt to like reasonably and fairly value their positions. There's a lot of evidence, I would say, that firms like to squint and not really value their positions. But particularly when there are markdowns coming, right? Those always seem to take longer than markups. There's some interesting academic evidence about VC firms doing some funky stuff around valuations right before they're going to be fundraising for their next fund, and so there are quite a few challenges there, and I think there's room for the ecosystem to grow and to do a better job, frankly, and for I think the auditors and the accountants to push firms to do a better job. But one of the things that we definitely focus on is valuation policy, right? Do you have a reasonably good valuation policy? Again, there's going to be a lot of squishiness. There's going to be a lot of gray. I'm sure we're not always going to be jazzed about what comes out on the other end. But in general, let's at least start with a foundation that has a pretty buttoned up valuation policy. I think the other piece that we definitely key in on is like how cash moves. I'll sort of categorize that broadly, right? So who's issuing capital calls, who's deciding on capital call amounts, who has access to the bank accounts, how many signatures are needed to send out wires, right? How are all these processes actually happening? Now, I think, for LPs that are looking at investments across multiple asset classes, it's interesting because if you take, for example, hedge funds. So hedge fund valuations are much more complicated, actually, in some ways than VC valuations, are much higher stakes because hedge funds are charging 2 and 20 on an annual basis. VC funds can do whatever they want in terms of valuation, but ultimately they're only getting paid that promote when that company exits, right? And so the incentive structures are a little bit different, or the value of playing around with valuations, or maybe just not revaluing positions as rapidly as maybe a firm should. There are negative effects of that, obviously, but in terms of like compensation, that plays a much bigger role in like the hedge fund world versus the VC world. Same thing you'd say like with cash controls, right? Where with hedge funds, you're constantly admitting new limited partners. Cash is moving around a lot. You're buying and selling positions on a more frequent basis. Nevertheless, we think it's extremely important from an operational perspective to have a well-defined cash control policy and a well-defined valuation policy, because they set the tone for, I think, how you're going to operate as a firm and how you're going to operate as an institution as you continue to grow. And so I think for us, no matter what size the firm is, we expect them to have a buttoned up valuation policy and a buttoned up cash control policy. And then there are, of course, other things that we ask about on the operational side, right? We want to ensure that they're using vendors that are reputable and they're using law firms that are reputable. We want to make sure that, they have not been convicted of serious crimes, or that there haven't been complaints of harassment or other things like that. And there's a longer tail list of policies and procedures that we also ask for. And I think we do have to be flexible, obviously, based on the stage of the fund, right? So I don't necessarily expect that a solo GP raising fund one is going to have a, 40-page cyber manual. But, if you're a $1 billion fund with, 25 employees, I do expect that you're going to have a policy for, how you deal with information internally and how information is protected, or how it's, shared and managed amongst different employees in the firm. So I think we have to be realistic about what we expect from, a solo GP or a first-time manager versus a more built-out institution. But in general, you tend to see, I think, sometimes holes in the operational side of businesses. The good news is I tend to find that many venture managers, while not necessarily doing so with a smile on their face, are happy to have a better understanding of where they maybe have operational holes or where they could maybe improve on the mid and back office side, because those tend to be easier fixes and they don't necessarily tend to poke at like the core or the heart of the firm, right? If you criticize somebody's investment policy or you push back on that, I think people, in a VC firm naturally tend to identify and associate with that a lot more and maybe tie some of their identity into that in a way that they just don't do for mid and back office, right? So when you have a suggestion for mid and back office, people tend to be a lot more open to that, I would say.
I'm surprised even for myself. I never emailed you asking for this operational due diligence piece.
I'll send it to you.
Send it to me. I would love it.
Will do.
And so to kind of break this down a little bit, just to give our audience some examples, so to speak, let's kind of go backwards up per se. Let's talk about like the information per se, like information being protected, information policy. I assume, like as you mentioned, most fund ones through threes aren't even beginning to think about that. But if they were to start thinking about it now, about how to protect certain pieces of information, what's a smart way to think about it?
So I'd say like a very simple fix, right, is if you are dealing with like PII, right? So let's say you're signing up an LP and you are getting their social security number, you're getting copies of their driver's license, right? You're getting a lot of pretty sensitive information. You should figure out who actually needs that information, right? Is it you, or is it your admin? Is it your, operations associate, like who actually needs that information? And then what's the way to protect that information the best, right? So if I am sending paper copies of subscription documents back and forth, or I'm sending you a quarterly capital balance statement by email, and that capital balance statement has your name and social security number and address, it's probably fine right up until like somebody hacks into somebody's email address, right? Or somebody's emails leak, or you accidentally, send one capital balance statement to the wrong person, right? And somebody gets somebody else's information. Now, obviously, a lot of funds are using Carta or other admins like that. And so avoided a lot of these problems, but we do tend to see that even firms that are using, the platforms that one would typically think of, information leaks, and emails get sent where there are attachments that shouldn't be maybe attached to an email, or things get sent in the body of an email that maybe shouldn't be. And so, whether it's a DocuSign subscription, or whether it's like a share file type subscription where you could just securely upload and securely email documents to your LPs, those are pretty low hanging pieces of fruit. And so I think those are things to think about. If it was my information and it leaked, would I be happy? And if the answer is no, then I think as a fund manager, you should really think about how to mitigate that risk, right? And how to deal with that. And the other thing I'd point out is people don't really think about this, but when the information leaks, it's not just bad for your LPs. It's bad for you as a firm, because that's your reputation, right? When people Google you going forward, and this doesn't happen often, right? But when it does, it's devastating, right? Because your reputation going forward is your information leaked, or somebody got your bank account information and you were emailing bank statements unencrypted to your part-time CFO, and now somebody goes into your bank account and withdraws some money, right? So figuring out how can we keep documents secure, how can we limit who actually accesses these documents, it tends to be really low-hanging fruit. I mean, it's nothing more than a subscription to a DocuSign or to a share file or something like that.
This is going to scratch my own itch, because I'm going to be honest, I haven't allocated nearly enough calories to the world of the hedge fund. And I just don't know how they do things. I'm like, I knew that they were calling, like they had the 220 incentive model on an annual basis, but other than that, I didn't know anything else outside of it. And
Yeah.
so I'm curious, in terms of valuation policy, could you compare and contrast like certain like good answers between like a hedge fund and a venture capital fund?
Yeah. So I'd say hedge funds are in some ways more complicated, but in some ways actually simpler, because they are, at least historically, right, they invested only in publicly traded securities. And so your price is pretty obvious, right? You know what the market price is as of the end of, the quarter, the month, or, the end of the year. And so that has historically not been as much of a challenge. The challenge with hedge funds is, reconciliation and ensuring that cash is moving in the right places, because you sell a position, you need to do something is going to happen with that cash, right? Where does it go? How do we manage it? How do we ensure it's being handled appropriately? With venture funds, and this is something I think a lot of LPs are going to be seeing now, because everybody's getting their Q4 or end of the year 2023 capital balance statements. Things are illiquid; they don't trade. I think that, again, auditors and accountants could do a much better job of pushing VC funds on explaining and justifying valuations, and really figuring out what the appropriate carrying valuation should be for a given position. And so I think, to me, the financial piece is more acute in hedge funds, because hedge funds are taking their 20 at least on an annual basis, whereas VC funds are not really taking that 20 until there's actually an exit. Nevertheless, they are, or do have, incentives to be creative with how and when to value positions, and when to mark up and when to mark down, because ultimately, right, VC funds are going to be out fundraising every 2 to 3 years. They need to be showing results. They want to have momentum. They want to have nice things to talk about in their quarterly emails, or in their, at their AGMs. And so from a financial perspective, I think that hedge funds have a much higher burden in terms of cash controls and annual valuations, because of that annual 20%. For VC funds, I think the incentives are just that they want to be able to show momentum when they go out to raise their next fund, and so obviously that creates certain structures or certain incentive perversions for them in terms of how they think about valuation. I think the other thing in VC is that you obviously, because these assets are not publicly traded, you can have different firms that are carrying assets at totally different valuations. Sometimes it's because they're in different share classes. Sometimes it's because one, maybe is on the board and maybe has information rights and knows a little bit more, and therefore they have a better ability to properly value the position. Some LPs like the volatility laundering that happens, like in private assets, right? And so they don't mind that assets are not being marked up or marked down, quite as acutely or quite as frequently. But I think ultimately, from a fiduciary perspective, I think that VC firms could be doing a lot better of a job, and I think auditors and accountants could be doing a lot better, in terms of figuring out what the appropriate valuation is for a private company. I mean, it's more difficult because they're not publicly traded, but it's certainly not impossible.
Maybe if I can give an example and you let me know how
Sure.
much of a fool I am, so to speak. And then we can and let me know if I am one, like what you would course correct, or what kind of answer you would like to hear. And so hypothetically, let's say I see a company and it's marked at a 30x multiple. And I'm like, holy cow, that multiple was decided in the year of 2021. And I just don't think its current value, especially as a function of revenue growth, is at a 30x. And
Yeah.
so what I'll do is I think it's better valued at like a 10x, just because that seems to be more fair market value for the kind of company and the like public market comparables there are. And so because of that, I'm like marking it down by like 67% or like 2/3 or whatnot. Um,
Yeah.
does that make sense in terms of evaluation policy, or are there things I'm not considering when I'm saying that statement?
I would say it makes sense, like high level, right, to sort of say what do comps look like for a company like this, right? I mean, I think that is a reasonable way to value companies, right? And I think it's a way it's certainly right taught in corporate finance classes, right? Is to look at a bunch of comps, figure out which are the most appropriate comps, and then sort of try to key in on evaluation. I think for us, part of the way that we think about this is that, again, just from a regulatory perspective, because we're SEC registered, the best policy for us is to be like mark takers, not mark makers. And so when a firm gives us a capital balance statement, I can certainly engage in a dialogue with the CFO or with some of the partners to figure out why they think that's an appropriate valuation. And I may or may not agree with that. But ultimately, just from a regulatory perspective, what we believe is the cleanest thing to do is to take the valuation, the marks that we're getting. And essentially, the implicit argument you make there is to say, regardless of what we think about from the outside, we have to sort of believe that these VC firms have some knowledge that we don't about these companies, and that's why they're holding them at these valuations. Take that sort of however you will, but that's sort of the argument we're making, and I think it's defensible. And I think there is an argument to be made, obviously, that if you are somebody on the board with information rights, you obviously know more about the company than one of your LPs, and so I think that is a fair and reasonable policy for us, and that's the one that we take. Now, when we're actually doing due diligence on a VC firm and they send us their track record, and I'm actually doing the analysis, I may say, hey, you're holding some fallen unicorn, right, at 75x. I think it's probably worth like 3x. What does that do to your track record? That's certainly an exercise we can and do engage in, and I think we have to, right? I think it's responsible to do that. But from a like mark perspective, we take the marks that we get and we will engage in constructive dialogues with the VC firm to understand why the mark is like that. What we will express our concerns, right, or try to figure out what is going into that mark. But ultimately, just we find it cleanest and most defensible from a regulatory and compliance perspective to say that we accept marks from the firms, and we will then pass those through in terms of our client statements.
Gotcha. And then so like the
Which
last
is not, by the way, which is not how everybody does it, right?
right.
I have friends who work at fund of funds, and they say, okay, we got this statement from somebody, we have this position, it's marked three different ways from three different funds, and they're all in the same share class. What should we do? And I think that they likely have more leeway than we do, but we try to stick to a more strictly compliant perspective given our regulatory regime.
I've heard, and I don't want to point any fingers here, but that there are some fund of funds out there that just will take the football field method equivalent of like these marks. If they have three different marks, they'll take the average or the median effectively instead of deciding
Yeah.
between all three. And there's some creative things going on there, and it's really up to interpretation
Sure.
because we invest in such an illiquid asset class.
Yeah, so I think it's true. I think ultimately there is a lot of creativity allowed in valuing illiquid assets. I don't even really mean that pejoratively necessarily. Now, I do think that there are firms that take advantage of that flexibility to do things that are maybe not standard or maybe not in the best interest of their LPs. Again, the question is that on them? Is that on the accountants and the auditors? Who should be ultimately responsible for that? I think the answer is kind of everybody. And I think it's also up, LPs should hold fund managers to account for things that they don't think are industry standard. But ultimately, I think this is definitely an area where, as an industry, venture could be doing quite a bit better.
I agree. And I think one of the useful things that I think about when I evaluate funds as an individual LP is oftentimes like, what are the incentives of someone telling me this?
Right.
And is it because they're fundraising now and that in that way that they have to look literally the best they can? Are they looking for a re-up? Are they looking for other things? And based on what their incentives could be in engaging in that conversation or sharing that fact, it gives you a better sense of where the truth is actually coming from. And if it is the
Right.
truth in quotes. Fascinating. And so I kind of want to like touch on one thing before we get
Sure.
closer to the curtain call of this conversation, which is the topic of geographies. And
Okay.
one of the things that in our conversations you've shared is that, hey, well, Integra invests in 4 different geographies: US, Europe, Israel, LATAM, and Europe being your most recent geography. We'll table that conversation for just a second, but roughly you allocate about, well, there's no like there's no 25 25 25 25 like percent allocation, and your model is a bit more fluid. So for example, there are some kind of investments you'll make in a year that's like, hey, you know what, we wanted to invest a lot into us, but us is just isn't looking as good as we expect it to, and so we're not allocating
Yeah.
nearly as much into the US market. What was your pitch to LPs, and how did you get your LPs comfortable with the fluidity of the model itself?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. So one is the way that we've sort of built the firm from the ground up in terms of how our clients compensate us. So we do not receive differential compensation from our clients for different asset classes. And so right off the bat, that removes the temptation to put money in a particular asset class. And so I think that is at a high level extremely helpful in that we are, I think, as aligned as possible with our clients in a way that allows us to think about what is best for them and their asset allocation. And it's not just us thinking about the asset allocation and then implementing it, right? We have ongoing dialogues with our clients. We have a robust onboarding process. And so we get a sense of what is appropriate for a given client and what their sort of functional needs are, right? So whether it's capital preservation versus growth, what their liquidity horizons are, how much risk tolerance they have, or how much illiquidity tolerance they have, and questions along those lines, that allows us to then build out like a portfolio for a given client. And it allows us to represent truthfully that, we have aligned to the greatest extent possible our incentives with our clients. And so I think that's one. And then as you sort of zoom into VC, I think in general, our clients believe that we are trying to identify the best managers, and they don't necessarily have a view on where those managers are going to come from. And so from a practical perspective, right, there are sort of these 4 regions that we focus on. But for us, what ultimately drives us is finding the best performing managers. And I don't just mean that in venture capital, I mean that across all the liquid asset classes, and finding the best performing opportunities. And so, yeah, to your point, we have sort of regions that we look at. Obviously there's 4 regions, right? So you sort of do the math and you'd like about 25% in each region in sort of an ideal world, but we don't feel like we are like structurally tied to that, right? What we feel like is we have a responsibility and we have an interest in finding the best performing managers. And so what that means is that, if this year in Europe, I find 5 managers that we think cross our threshold, and I only find 1 in the U.S., then we'll invest in 1 in the U.S. and 5 in Europe, right? And next year, if it's 3 and 3 or 4 and 2, we can do that because ultimately the guiding star for us is performance. It's not checking particular boxes around geographic concentration, let's say within venture capital. So as long as we are deriving the best performance for our clients within their investment objectives, that's our job, right? Our job is to not, not to check the right boxes and say, hey, we did 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%, because that's aesthetically pleasing, right? It's about finding the best performing managers no matter where they are.
You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of something I heard on, if I'm getting the attribution right, like Tim Ferriss show. And there's this guy called Simon Coronel, um, who's been a world champion and won multiple first places in the world of magic. So great magician and all that. And one thing he said, at least about I think it's called the International Federation of Magicians or Magic. And that every year there are these competitions where you go to it and you kind of like perform your magic set alongside some of the world's best magicians. And one of the interesting things I think he said in that interview is that there are some years where no first places are awarded, in the sense that, which I always found to be really interesting. It's like, well, if you're the best that year, you should get the first place, you should get the second place, or whatever it is. And he said there are some years where there are multiple second places, but there's no first place. And the way it is evaluated is by, just because you're the best in that year doesn't mean you get first place, but you have to be as good as the previous year's first place, if not better, for you to be given a first place. And in that world, getting a first place in the world of magic means a lot more when you have it.
Sure.
And so there's a parallel here, at least I'm drawing in my head, is when you're talking about how you're allocating for Integra. When you're putting into a US fund or a European fund, or like, an Israeli fund, it has to be as good, if not better, than the previous funds you've invested in that geography. And if it's not there, you just won't allocate to that geography or nearly as much to that geography that year.
Right. So I'd even go further than that, right? I'd say not only does it have to be the best in the geography, but it actually has to be better than the incremental dollar we could put in any other geography, right? So when I worked at Amazon, like one of the interesting things they have is they have like this bar raiser concept, right? So when you're interviewing, maybe like 5 people from the team you're actually interviewing for will interview you. And then there's one person from some random spot in the company who's been specially trained as like what they call a bar raiser. And essentially the idea is that every new employee should be better than like the median current employee. And so it's not just about, are you better than the median employee on your current team, but are you better than the median employee like in the entire company? And so we don't think about it exactly like that, but I don't think it's completely dissimilar, right? In the sense that it's not just did we find a slightly better European manager than the previous one we invested in. It's, I have an incremental dollar. Should that dollar go to this US manager or this European manager? And so I think we can sort of believe that over time, if you take like a long enough time horizon, we would expect that we'll see good managers like across these 4 regions, and we'll wind up in a relatively balanced place. But like on a quarter to quarter or year to year basis, I don't feel any particular need, and our mandate is not to like put a dollar in each bucket, right? It's to put a dollar in the best bucket. And if that means that one bucket gets a lot of dollars in a given year, in a given quarter, and the other one doesn't, that is fine, because it's better for our clients, right? I don't think that our clients want us to say, please invest in subpar managers just so that we can fill up, these buckets equally. Though I would note that that is not a universally held view. I mean, there are a lot of, by name or by reputation, extraordinarily sophisticated investment managers that have extremely rigid targets around, whether it's geographic allocation or whether it's asset allocation. And they basically say, well, I only saw 4 good managers this year, but I have to invest in 8 managers. So let me find the 4 good ones and the 4 least bad ones. And like, that's just how it works, right? We don't think about it like that. For us, it's really about enthusiastically allocating that next incremental dollar, not just doing it because we feel like we must, because we have to check a box. And the other thing I'd say, really long answer to your sort of short prompt.
I love long answers. That's the purpose of the podcast.
To build on what you said, right, about you have to be better, to win this first place prize than the person who won it last year. The way that we think about VC, right, is both on an absolute and a relative basis, right? So on an absolute basis, we have to be able to underwrite a manager to 3x net or better, or ideally 4x net or better, because otherwise the lockup doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense to lock up your money for 10 or 12 or 15 years with pretty limited distributions. And so in order to be able to even consider a VC fund for our portfolio, we have to be able to underwrite it to at least 3x, but again, ideally like 4x or better. But then there's also a relative component, right? Which is we're not looking for the best relative managers, but understanding whether this is a really good year or sort of a weak year, right? You might be the best manager of a given vintage, but in absolute terms, you actually might not be quite as impressive, or we might not be able to underwrite you to that 3 or 4x threshold. So I think the absolute piece is sort of the red line for us, right? We need to be able to underwrite to that absolute return. But that relative piece is also really helpful because it contextualizes the performance of a given manager, and it helps us understand, how much did you benefit from like broader macro conditions, right? How much did you benefit from everything that was going on in 2020 and 2021, right? And so if you're the top decile manager in 2021, that's awesome, right? That's great. And we should be happy about that, obviously, because we can assume that all the managers in 2021 benefited from, everything that was happening, right? But we still have to take a step back and say, notwithstanding like whatever your relative performance is, do we believe that when you come to market again in 2024 or 2025, that we can underwrite this new fund to a 3 or 4x? And so I think, it's the absolute threshold, but we use that relative piece to contextualize the absolute performance.
That makes a lot of sense. And also, I've been talking to a lot of like LPs, and a lot of them have said that there are certain vintages of the past few years, especially the pandemic years, which may not look really not as good as some of the other ones. It's too early to tell,
Yeah,
obviously, but just because the valuations were just so damn high, and the only antidote, I wouldn't say only, sorry, one of the antidotes to that effectively were LPs really like managers that booked in distributions during those crazy years,
sure.
because that protected their downside, especially in those hefty years. And there's another element of, I've been chatting with a lot of like family offices and LPs, and obviously their incentive model is slightly different because they're doing their own money. And one of the things they realize is they
Sure.
don't live and breathe venture like you and the team at Integra does. And so for them, time diversity means a lot more. It's hard for them to time market because they don't breathe the market nearly as much as you do, and proactively, enthusiastically go find those managers.
Right. So I think, the first point is always a little bit strange to me, that DPI point, right? I think it's become sort of the buzzword of venture lately.
Yeah.
To me, the challenge there is less about philosophically whether you believe that managers should let their positions ride till the end, or whether they should get out early. That's sort of a different discussion for a different day. But regardless of where you sort of fall out there philosophically, the same environment that created the chaos of 2020 and 2021, right? And I guess the beginning of 2022 is the same argument in which that DPI was generated. And so all a manager has done when they've generated DPI in 2020 and 2021 is shown that in an environment in which there was a lot of activity happening and there was like a non-trivial amount of DPI, but they also got DPI, right? The question is, can you underwrite that DPI in an environment in which there's much less activity, right? And how valuable is that DPI to you? Or how valuable are those data points that you've gleaned about their historical DPI on a going forward basis? And so to me, DPI generated in a chaotic environment is sort of similar to TVPI generated in a chaotic environment, right? Which is that it's great if it happened, but let's contextualize it properly and don't sort of overweigh. Don't go overweight DPI, right, when you're evaluating managers, because it's helpful, but there's a larger story that has to sort of be told there. And so to me, I think what I have seen lately is probably a little bit too much of a reliance on DPI. I'm not saying it's not helpful. I'm not saying people shouldn't think about it. I think it is, again, related to that philosophical question of whether you think managers should sell off some of their positions earlier, whether they should ride them to the end. But I do think there's a lack of contextualization around DPI. And if you're looking for quick and early DPI, talk to some of my colleagues. Like there are some other asset classes like we could definitely talk about that are going to be much more attractive, right, from a cash flow and growth perspective than venture capital.
Yeah.
To me, venture DPI, and in particular DPI that was generated during these chaotic times, should be contextualized properly, vis-a-vis both the times, but also like the broader role of venture within a portfolio. And so I think that's a challenge that a lot of LPs need to think through is, how much weight should you give to DPI versus to everything else, that you're sort of seeing in the portfolio.
I totally agree. No variable, DPI, TVPI, IRR, you name it, kind of thing. Graduation rates, fund size, check size should be held in isolation to everything else. I love the framework that you had about relative comparison as well as like absolute comparison. And I will
Yeah.
also say this kind of like harkens on a point that we underscored earlier on in the conversation, which is the word replicate. Like if you were able to get book in DPI or insane TVPI during the pandemic years, are you capable of replicating it when the market doesn't look like the one that it did in a once in a blue moon period of time?
Right. I think that's the big challenge, right? And that's something people have to think about. And so that's where I think it's helpful when we say, let me see your angel track record, or let me see your track record from your previous firm, that you were at from 2015 to 2019, because I think all those data points help tell a story, right?
Yeah.
And so if you see data points that are telling a pretty consistent story and 2020 just put some fuel on the fire, great, no problem. If you're seeing a more muddled story and then 2020 shows up and all of a sudden things get pretty great, I think it raises the obvious question of which is the real performance that we should, expect going forward. And sometimes there's a good reason for why, 2020 is actually much more representative of what you will be doing going forward, but it at least bears a discussion. And so I think that to us is a very important reason to request that information. I know that GPs don't like it. Candidly, that's just part of our process, and we find it extremely valuable. And so we request it, and it's necessary for us. Yeah, I think more funds need to be doing that. The other thing I would say is, you mentioned IRR, so I don't want to get too much on the soapbox here, but I will say that in venture, we don't look at IRR at all. Actually, we totally discount it because manipulating IRR is far too easy with timing of capital calls and with credit lines and with various other levers that can be pulled by a GP. And so we feel like IRR is in venture is basically useless. And so we actually don't look at it at all. So I agree that there's not like a single silver bullet metric that tells the whole story. But I do think that, at least in our view, there's a metric that is not particularly useful. And that's how we feel about IRR. We just feel like there are too many levers that funds can pull to materially change their IRR. And so we don't look at it at all.
Evan, I know we're in the back half of the conversation now. I've enjoyed every second
Yeah,
of
sure.
this, but would like to take things a little bit more lighthearted and get some
Sure.
personality going on in at least into the humans, like the world outside of venture for Evan. And to kind of to ease us into that world, I'll start with a mix between the two, which is I'm curious, what was the most significant life lesson you learned from pitching AT&T as the VP at Tamid back in college to being on the investment committee member at between Raise and Slush when investing into like VC and PE managers?
I think the biggest lesson is just that life takes a lot of twists and turns that you can't necessarily plan. If I look back at sort of where I was in college and where I thought I would wind up, and I look back, when I was in consulting and where I thought that would lead me, when I look back when I went to school and where I thought that would lead me, I think that you have to create a lot of optionality for yourself. I think that's sort of the biggest lesson that I've learned, because you don't know where things are going to wind up, or how things are going to play out. And so I think just trying to put yourself in positions to be successful. I think that is the best you could do, right? I mean, and then however things sort of play out, it's not up to you.
But as a last question over here, with a culinary library of honestly some of the world's best restaurants, I'm curious, and a little fly on the wall told me that I mean you eat kosher, so I'm curious, what is your favorite
Yeah.
kosher restaurant in New York City?
So I'll say that the last three that I've taken people to for business meetings have been there's a steakhouse called Tabernacle. There's a modern bistro called Barnea, and there's like a nice French place called Patisse. They're all like in Midtown Manhattan. And I'm hoping that one of their owners will be listening to the podcast, and maybe I'll get a discount on my next bill. But yeah, they're all different styles, but yeah, they're all great. I think having being in New York and being able to take people out to it's a kosher restaurant. So I think is nice. I don't know. I assume Finn probably told you because I've brought him into the world of kosher restaurants. But yeah, I mean, I think it's great. It's awesome to be able to take people out, right? I mean, different people have different dietary restrictions, and so the fact that we live so close to a place like New York, where anybody, regardless of what kind of food they like or what kind of dietary restrictions they have, or whatever style they like to eat, there's always something. I think is awesome. So yeah, it's great. I love it, and taking people out, right? I think it's a big part of the job, right? Just that face to face interaction. Zoom is awesome, podcasts are awesome, but I think just being able to meet people in person, in a casual setting and have that relationship, I think is totally different.
Oh, I hear you. And for like, I know you're based in Philly now, but like, for folks who are
Yeah.
going to those restaurants in New York, maybe they'll just send you an email. It's like, hey, you know what? I just took a photo at Tabernacle, and I got to try this. Thank you
I,
for the recommendation. And often I think goes a long wavelength to one, show that one, they've listened to them to this
I,
podcast, and two, have understood the personal part of you as well. Um,
yeah, I hope they do, because I think those restaurants are good on their own terms, not just as kosher restaurants. But the more pictures I get, the better argument I'll have for getting a discount on my next bill.
Exactly. And then this all goes into the marketing. You'll be an influencer at some point, and next thing I know, you're
Exactly.
at Evan.foodie or kind of thing on Instagram.
Exactly. We'll be sponsoring restaurants. Yeah, it'll be a good time. But yeah, it is also a good test to make sure the conversion from minute 1 to minute 60 of the podcast is pretty high, right? We'll see who got here to the restaurant portion.
We'll see who got to the restaurant portion, and then you let me know, because they'll go in your inbox. They won't come through my inbox. So you let me know like which folks listen through to the very end, and it's also a great way to just like people who have just respected their time and listened to the very end and learned all these tidbits, from operational due diligence to the fact that you don't like really think too much about like IRR, at least in the world of venture. Those are all such interesting tidbits that is ripe for open for discussion for when they reach out to you. Anyways, we are at the tail end of this, Evan. This has been thoroughly enjoyable. I know you shared your email already, so I won't bore people again with another email read, but we got to have an episode 2, because as you know, I sent you so many more questions that we had time to dig into, but thank you for humoring every second here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, would love to do this again. I have plenty of stuff I could get on a soapbox about and talk about, and maybe we'll get some feedback from the listeners and see if there are other topics they want me to jump into. But yeah, would absolutely love to do this again. I think it'll be a great time.
I mean, at some point we might just do a Lex Friedman 8-hour podcast. So, stay tuned for that. No promises yet, but thank you so much.
That's going to require some more snacks, I think, and some more hydration. But yeah, let's see what the listener count looks like for this one first.
That sounds good. Evan, take care. Thank you so much, and I know a lot of our listeners will reach out to you.
All right, amazing. Thank you so much, David. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'll probably have my wife listen to the first cut, so she could be like, "I'm not sure you should listen to this." Yeah. Also, I think it's helpful, like, to have somebody. We've actually talked about this internally, right? Like, sometimes you want like a red team, like, who's totally fresh and not like associated with whatever you're working on, right? To look things over and just give you like a perspective and a point of view, right? And I think that's sometimes helpful. And my wife tends to have a good perspective on these things, so yeah, she'll be a good listener, and she won't leak the episode ahead of time, so you don't have to worry about that.
She won't. If I remember correctly, if I did my research right, like she's a pediatrician, right?
Yeah, so my wife is a pediatric nephrology fellow at CHOP. She is a super talented doctor with much more to give to the world than I have. And yeah, she works on really complicated cases with very sick children. And they have a remarkable ability to give these kids like an amazing long quality of life. I mean, obviously not every story has a happy ending, but in general, nephrology, I think it's interesting for my wife because it's typically not just a kidney problem. It's like the kidney is part of the problem, but usually like there's a big system problem. But in CHOP in particular, they have amazing resources for children suffering through various kidney issues. And my wife and her colleagues are amazingly talented and well trained and deal with things that are frankly miraculous. They are able to give quality of life to children, or extend life for children in situations that, frankly, I think boggle the mind in a lot of cases. Not every case is like that, right? Sometimes it's more vanilla type situation. But yeah, my wife is she's incredibly talented, and she works with some really talented folks as well. And her colleagues work very hard. They really torture you in med school and residency and fellowship. But yeah, my wife has handled it in a way that I never could, and she's an amazing physician, and yeah, to her credit.
I want to give a special shout out to today's sponsor, Alchemist Accelerator. Backed by the likes of Coastal Ventures, Mayfield, Salesforce, just to name a few, Alchemist is the top B2B startup accelerator that's been around since 2012, backing founders from day one. And if you've been around for 12 years and running laser focused only on one industry, you build this incredible set of flywheels, and positive feedback loop is absolutely insane. We back the best enterprise talent who go on to change the world in which we live in, who then come back to their hometown, coach, and mentor the next generation of world-class enterprise talent. And don't take it just from me. Alchemist has backed the likes of Launch Darkly, Rigetti, Privacera, Mo Engage, FarmWise, just to name a few, many of which who have come back as mentors and coaches for the current classes of Alchemist. If you're curious and want to get more involved in the Alchemist ecosystem, check out alchemistaccelerator.com/superclusters. That's an S at the beginning and S at the end, and we'll include the link in the show notes below. Till next, stay awesome. Hey Superclusters fans, David from Post here, and if you're tuning in from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever podcasts find your ear, it'd mean the world to me if you left a review. For those from the YouTube universe, let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments, and it'd mean a lot to me if you could share this episode with just one other person who'd get a kick out of today's topics. I'm on the road to publishing to at least 100 episodes of Superclusters, so every comment, question, review helps me make this experience more helpful, exciting, and fun for you. And lastly, I want to share a quick disclaimer. The views expressed in this episode are for informational purposes only and are solely the views of myself and the guest alone. They are not representative of Alchemist Accelerator. None of the views expressed herein constitute legal, investment, business, or tax advice. Any allusions or references to funds or companies are for illustrative purposes only and should not be relied upon as investment recommendations. Consult a professional investment advisor prior to making any investment decisions. And that's all from me. See you on the next.